Hello, this is Doris Ann Mertz from the Custer County Library. Welcome to part 3 of our ACT English Prep. We talked some last time about various forms of punctuation, and we ended talking about apostrophes and using them with pronouns. And now we're going to go into more discussion about pronouns. So pronouns are words that take the place of nouns, and we often mix up when to use the subjective case of the pronoun and when to use the objective case of the pronoun. The subjective case of the pronoun is one you should use when it's the subject, like I am going to town. You wouldn't say me am going to town. So these are when your word is taking the place of the noun that is doing something, the subject. And there are singular forms and there are plural forms, such as we and they. Now, the objective case, on the other hand, is something is happening to this pronoun, and these often come after prepositions. So we're going to go into that in more detail. So you always use the object pronoun in a prepositional phrase. So if the sentence says, the package was addressed to both my sister and me. And the easiest way to know when to use me or I, a lot of people say I. They'd say the package was addressed to both my sister and I, but that's not correct. You take out these other words, my sister and say, the package was addressed to I. Does not make sense. That sounds awful. So the package was addressed to me. So just get rid of some of this other clutter and see if you should use me or I. And you always use the objective case, the me, when you have a preposition here. Okay, so between you and me, I don't think she's very talented. So we're talking about between you and me. Between is a preposition, so it's between you and me, not between you and I. All right, you always use the subject pronoun when the pronoun is the subject of the sentence. So when you're a kid, you have kind of the opposite problem of what we do now, where we often say I at the end rather than me. But when you're a kid, you say, me and her is going to go to town or something like that. But it really is she and I are the same age. She and I are going to go to town. So you use the subject pronoun when you're replacing the subject of a sentence. Now there's something that's a little bit confusing, and this is the case when you use the subject pronoun, and it doesn't sound exactly right to our ears, but you do use a subject pronoun in cases where you're using than or as. So in the sentence, Patty is older than I, you would use I instead of Patty is older than me, because it's really, you're saying Patty is older than I am. So you really need to use the subject case. No one is as competitive as he instead of as him. It's no one is as competitive as he is what it's really saying. So when you have than and as, you would use I or he, the subject case of the pronouns. All right. We're going to talk about when to use who and when to use whom. This gives people a lot of trouble, and what I do is I just use the him or he test. I reorder the part of the sentence containing who or whom and rephrase it to see if I should use he or him. If him is the proper choice, then whom is the correct, and they both end in M. You can think of it that way. Now if we're talking about a girl, it would be her instead of him, but just think about if it says whom, you're going to use the him or her instead of the he or she. So let's do that. Let's practice. So I wonder who or whom he bribed to get this position. So if we reorder that, we'd say to get this position, he bribed him. And since him is the proper form, we're going to use whom. Whom is the answer. So whom should also be used after prepositions, but not before verbs, because it's not a subjective case pronoun. It is an objective case pronoun. So after prepositions, we're talking about like, to whom should I address this letter, or something like that. So to is a preposition, or for whom does the bell toll. So, all right, we're going to talk now about some indefinite pronouns. Indefinite pronouns, such as anybody, everyone, they don't refer to a specific person, and here's a whole group of them that are always singular, and they need singular verbs. Each, either, neither, everyone, no one, anyone, All of these are singular and always require singular verbs. And then there are some indefinite pronouns that are always plural. Both, few, many, several, these are always plural and they need plural forms of the verbs. Now there are some indefinite pronouns that can be both singular or plural. And here's a few of them: all, any, most, none, or some. We're going to go over this some more in a few minutes, but basically they're plural if you can count them and singular if you can't. So if you would say all of the cookies, you can count cookies, so that would be a plural form. But if you're saying all of the salt, you can't count salt, so then you would use the singular form. All right, so we're going to talk some about bad habits. So one of the common mistakes we make when speaking, and sometimes it transfers into our writing, is that we don't have our pronoun match our antecedent, and that's the noun it's replacing. So in this case, we're saying, does everyone, which we just learned was a singular pronoun, does everyone have their passport? That's wrong, because there is a plural pronoun and everyone is singular. So it sounds weird, but we really should say, does everyone have his or her passport? Because this is singular, this needs to be singular. And this is usually test on the ACT, so you really want to take note of this. All right. And just as subjects, nouns and pronouns must agree with their verbs, pronouns must also agree with their antecedents, which are the words they replace. So we just talked about using his or her instead of their, and we're going to look at this. Many have found their free time has all but disappeared. This is correct because we learned that many is a plural word. Many and several and few, we talked about those. And we also talked about some that are sometimes singular and sometimes plural. So all of the chocolate is gone. It was delicious. So all of the chocolate is gone. So it needs a singular verb because this cannot be counted. You can't count chocolate. So all of the chocolate is gone. It was delicious. So the pronoun needs to be singular as well. So if we're talking about cookies, which we can count, we say all of the cookies are gone. So it's got a plural verb, and they were delicious. So you just got to, if you can count them, then you use the plural form, and if you cannot count them, like chocolate, salt, things like that, then you use the singular form. All right, let's do a little bit of practice. Most kayaks are made of rubberized cloth, molded plastic, or fiberglass. It is covered except for the opening in which the paddler or paddlers sit. All right, let's look down here at number 47. Do we need to leave it is, or so it's they're looking at what kind of pronoun should we use? One is, they are, or which are. So we were talking about kayaks. That's what the pronoun's taking the place of, and it's a plural form. So really we should use they are. So the answer is C. All right. We're going to talk, we talked about who and whom earlier and when to use which, but we're going to talk some more about when to use who, when to use that, and when to use which. Okay, you use who or whom when you're referring to people. A lot of times when we're talking, we don't do this, but we really should say, she is the one who fixed my computer, not she is the one that fixed my computer. We're talking about a person, so it's she is the one who fixed my computer. Now, you use that when you're referring to things. And you also use which when you're referring to things. But this is the computer that is having problems. Okay. You use which when you're introducing clauses that are not essential to the information in the sentence. Unless they refer to people, then you'd use who. But which is introducing non-essential information. So when we learned earlier, when we introduce non-essential information, we're going to be using commas. So when we use the word which, we're going to be using commas. And so let's look at a couple of examples. Mark is in Toronto. Which is his favorite city? So this is non-essential. It's introduced with which, you use a comma. Rosa, who writes for the school paper, wants to interview me for a story. So this is non-essential information. You could take this little clause out and it makes sense. Rosa wants to interview me for a story. Since we're talking about a person, we would not use which or that. We would use who. Okay. we're going to talk a little more in detail about that, which, and who, and whether it's essential or not. So when that begins a clause, the information is always essential, and you never use commas. So just remember, when that is in the clause, it's essential information. When which begins a clause, it's non-essential, and you always use a comma. So that, you never use a comma because it's essential. Which, you do use a comma because it's non-essential. Now, when you're using who to begin a clause, it could be essential or non-essential. It just depends. So let's look at some examples. Here's an example of essential information. Customers who make purchases before Christmas have a month to return their items. It's not just all customers have a month to return their items. It's only those who make purchases before Christmas. So this is essential information, and you do not use commas. Here's an example of using who to set off non-essential information. My mother, who has always been overprotective, said I couldn't go out with Jim. So this sentence still makes sense and still has the same meaning. My mother said I couldn't go out with Jim. You've just thrown in some extra information, so you're going to need to use commas to set it off. All right, let's do a little review, and we're going to review some apostrophes, pronouns, different things that we've learned over the last couple of lessons. Okay, your dog is growling at me. Is it your without an apostrophe or your with this apostrophe? So let's try. You are. Your dog is growling at me. That makes no sense, so we know it's your, Y-O-U-R. He's the one, that or who won the prize. So is it he is the one, or is it his the one? His is a possessive form of he. So this is not correct because there's not a noun following it directly. So like in his car, that would be the correct form of correct use of his. So he is the one. Would you use that or who won the prize? It's taken the place of a person, so we're going to use who. He is the one who won the prize. Does anyone know whose cell phone this is? So would we say, does anyone know whose cell phone this is? No, that does not make sense. So does anyone know whose cell phone this is? Possessive form. This is the lady which, that, or who reminds me of my mother. So this is an easy one because it's talking about a lady who is a person. We know we need to use who. This is the lady who reminds me of my mother. George and Michael left his or their backpacks at school. Well, we're talking about two people, so that's a plural subject, so we are going to have to use their. To who or to whom should I address this letter? Let's rephrase it. I should address this letter to him, so we know we're going to use whom. All right, he feels more strongly about it than me or I. Remember, this is that rule where we were talking about than and as, and we would say than I do is what it's really saying. So it's he feels more strongly about it than I, not than me. Even though than me is the way we would probably talk, it properly should be than I. All right, she invited John, Zach, and me or myself to the party. I wish I had an I option in there too, because a lot of people, when they talk, they try to sound proper, and they would say, she invited John, Zach, and I to the party, and that's not correct, because if you knocked out John, Zach, and it'd say she invited I to the party, which doesn't make sense. Myself is not correct. She invited myself to the party is not the proper use of myself. So it's she invited John, Zach, and me to the party. Do you know where your homework is? So let's just say, do you know where your homework is? That makes no sense, so we know it's going to be your. And just these are totally different things. Your is a possessive pronoun, and you are is a subject and a verb that's just been shortened with an apostrophe. All right, so he is the one that or who showed me to the office. Since it's taken the place of a person, he is the one who showed me to the office. Neither of the students could find his or their notes from last week's seminar. Neither is one of those words that we learned was singular. It's a singular pronoun. So it would be his. Nobody has or have to tolerate lies from a partner. Nobody is also one that we learned was a singular pronoun, so nobody has to tolerate lies from a partner. All right, that's all we're going to cover for today, and I'll see you next time.